What's going on, guys? Today I'm actually going to be reshimming my valves in my 2JZ. If you want to click around through the progress bar to each one of the sections that I'll be talking about, I'm basically going to be talking about my spreadsheet. So I'll be measuring the valve lash, measuring the buckets, put in the spreadsheet that does all the calculations. Not only does it do the calculations whenever you put in your measurement that you get from your feeler gauge, along with the measurement when you measure the thickness of your buckets. And then you put in your ideal valve lash that's either in your Toyota service manual or what's on your cam card. And once you put those three measurements in, the spreadsheet does everything for you for all 24 valves, as long as you put in measurements for each one of the 24 valves. It also gives you the Toyota part number associated with that shim size, and then trying to see what shims that I will put in. And yes, this is a long video, but it's a long video because it's a long process. And if you're pulling them from a junkyard, as I am, which before you click away from this video, I'm actually going to show you also later in the video how to inspect the junkyard shims with a laser pointer, and depending on how the light scatters, you can tell if it's bad. Just running your finger over the top of it is not good enough. So I'm going to be showing how to do that, along with not the entire shim process for every one of the valves, but I will be showing how it's done on one or two of the valves. I will also be swapping from the shim over bucket to the shimless buckets. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm running an oversized camshaft that has larger lobes. And basically, if you don't know what that means, then you probably have a stock camshaft, and you can just go through the entire shimming process like normal and use the shim over buckets. And just talk about the reasons really quickly that I'm upgrading to these shimless buckets versus these shim over buckets is one of the reasons being the weight of them. So if you feel the weight of this, I just measured it and it's between 1.5 and 1.6 ounces. It kind of bounces back and forth, where this one, it's almost right at 1 ounce. So you have a considerable weight difference. And if you're thinking like 24 of these is going to be about 24 ounces, where 24 of these is going to be 30 something, 36, 37, 38 ounces, 40 ounces. So like there's a considerable weight difference between these two. So they're lighter, you have less metal mass. Another reason is on larger cams, these so on mine, these are gold, but they're not always gold. They're sometimes just the same steel color as this. So what ends up happening is if you upgrade your cams and your valve springs, then this is fairly easy for it to pop out of place and pop out of the bucket, and then you have a shim that's floating around in your head and just wreaking havoc. And this is a very tough steel. I don't know about these particularly because it's like the golden ones, but normally like this is a tool steel, so it's a high grade steel. And if this is floating around in an aluminum head being squished by a camshaft, it's going to destroy a bunch of stuff. So there's that. But one of the cooler reasons is this. If you look at the top of this, there's a lip from the edge of the bucket to the top of this shim. So these shims are 28 millimeter shims, which means the top of this, the only surface that your cam lobe touches, is 28 millimeters. Where this is 31 millimeters. And I have a little graphic popping up that I pulled from kelfordcams.com, and they have a whole article on this basically, but there's a slight performance benefit to upgrading to these, not only because they're lighter, but because you get a slightly longer duration running these. So you actually have a little bit better performance, not only because these are lighter, you'd have a slightly better performing engine because your duration would be a little bit better, since these have more of a contact surface on top than these do. I'll also be showing how you measure it. That's with the dial indicator. It's a magnetic base dial indicator, and I have it stuck to the top of my toolbox. So I'm going to set up my tripod and I'm going to start going through the head, unbolting the cams. Take extreme caution while you're unbolting your cams. I like unbolting them a quarter turn at a time. The book even says to unbolt them sequentially. The book even mentions a pattern that you're supposed to follow to unbolt the cams. Loosen them a quarter turn at a time, and then slowly lift them out. So getting into this, here I am slowly rotating the camshaft via the bolt that's on the very front of the camshaft that holds the cam gear in place. And what I'm doing is I'm taking my feeler gauge and I'm measuring the gap between that cam lobe and the bucket. So the smallest side of the cam lobe, as it comes close to that bucket, there's room for error here, because if a feeler gauge that's 0.203 goes in, but the 0.229, which is the next one up, does not go in, your valve lash can be anything between 0.203 and 0.228. That's why it's a good idea to actually swap your buckets around a little bit and then measure again to get 2 different measurements, because with those 2 different measurements, you will have 2 different valve lashes with 2 different bucket sizes. If you compare those 2 sets of numbers together, you can find a measurement that's a little bit closer to being accurate than you would if you had just measured with 1 bucket and 1 feeler gauge. I'll show that in the spreadsheet a little bit later, how you can use the spreadsheet to determine what a more accurate shimless bucket size or shim size is that you should be putting in place of the other one. I'm going to loosen every one of these sequentially. It's going to take me probably 5 minutes to get this camshaft unbolted because I'm going to take my time with it. These are stiff springs. Do not want to snap this camshaft. And measuring the thickness of the valve bucket, since this is a magnetic based dial caliper, then at nighttime this gauge shows slightly different than it does in the daytime because the metal heats up and it expands, and then science happens and you end up with a slightly different gauge. One, the top has to be clean, so I'll clean it off. Trying to put it on the little dot. I put this right on the middle, in the middle of the dot. So this one, I just add 0.1 to this. So this is 0.213 thousandths of an inch. So 0.213 thousandths of an inch. So this spreadsheet, you can find it on my website. The link is down in the description, and also I have the link laid out in the very bottom of this video. So this is a spreadsheet that I have built for adjusting my valve lash, and there's a couple of really cool things that I have built into it. So it allows me to more easily find what my total height is, which is my shim size, plus what I'm measuring with my feeler gauge. This allows me to pretty easily swap out to a different bucket and then measure with a different feeler gauge so that I can get a more accurate total height. So there's an automated total height column that automatically figures up what your shim size plus your clearance is. And then there is an optional override so that I could type a number in here if I find a higher total height measured with 1 shim plus the clearance on top of that. So everything from the very, very top of the valve stem to the very bottom of your cam lobe. That's what I mean by total height. And I should mention that if you're watching this and you're reshimming a completely different engine, if you're doing a Ducati or if you're doing a Yamaha or whatever you're doing, I will be talking at the end of this video exactly how this spreadsheet works and all the details behind the formulas and how the numbers are calculated and everything. So one, if you're watching this video and you want peace of mind that all the calculations are being done well and you want to double check my work, then you can watch how the spreadsheet works and then figure out for yourself whether or not this all works like it's supposed to. Or if you want to custom tailor this to, say, a Ducati that has an opening shim and a closing shim on one valve, I'm going to talk about that at the end of this video. So you can jump through to the end if you want to see all the details and how all the calculations works and how I built this. And another thing that's worth mentioning is I have added in the functionality for the shim over buckets, so you don't have to enter in this total height of this entire bucket plus shim size. You can actually just pop the shim out of the bucket if you want to, and you can type that in. And if you want to just replace those shims or figure out what it is, so if I did 2.75 and that's my actual shim size, and if I come over here, then that's a shim over bucket, then closest OE shim available is also telling me 2.75 because these two numbers are the same. But if my measured clearance that I get with the feeler gauge is different from the recommended clearance that what I want the engine to be, then it would give me a different shim size. But this is the part number, and I could go and I can Google that part number and find it, buy it, whatever, and then wait on it to come in the mail. So right now I'm just going to breeze through really quickly and then show you the absolute basics of how to use this spreadsheet that I've built, and what numbers you need to put in, what cells, where you get those numbers from, and then where you look at the calculations, what your shim size is, and then how you can take these numbers for the shimless buckets that the spreadsheet gives you, put them in Google, search for them, wait for them to come from whatever website you order them from, and then put them into your engine. Immediately after that, I'm going to talk about the more detailed process of how to precisely dial in that shimming process. And it takes a few more steps, but it is far worth it in the end. So jumping into this, the first thing you're going to do is, like I said a little bit earlier, if you remember, I measured that shim plus the bucket and I got 0.213 decimal inches. Well, I'm going to go over here to the right and I'm going to look up on this little calculation section 0.213 and then see what that is in millimeters. That's 5.42. If you have a number that doesn't show up over here, then unfortunately you'll have to Google it. So I'll take this 5.42, I'll come over here, and in this cell for valve number 9 on cylinder 5. So 5.42 is the measurement that I would put into this cell because that is the actual shim size as it says up here at the top of this column. So you would do that same process for every one of these, put all of those different measurements in whatever valve, like whatever place it goes into in the head. Valve 1 being all the way up by the cam gear, and then valve 12 being all the way at the very back of the head. Then you would lube up the camshaft, tighten down all the bolts that you need to tighten down sequentially, not tightening down one any more than the other one, but go through sequentially, tighten down the camshaft, torque it down, and then after it's torqued down, you take a feeler gauge and you go through and you measure from valve 1 behind the camshaft all the way to the back of the head at valve 12, and you write down all of these numbers. Once you put those in here, you would take your recommended clearance that would be in your Toyota service manual for whatever engine you're working on. In the case of the 2JZ and a few other Toyota engines, you would have 0.15 millimeter to 0.25 millimeters. So once you put it in up here, all of these cells actually copy whatever is up here. So if it's 0.1234, then all of the other ones are just, they're going to, well, it rounds down, but all the other ones are going to be 0.123 because all these other ones copy what's in this one. So 0.152 is what I want my recommended clearance to be because that's the feeler gauge that I have that I'm using. Toyota recommended is 0.150. 0.02 of an inch doesn't make that much of a difference. And then after I put this recommended clearance in, the spreadsheet does everything for you. It calculates the total height, which is your actual shim plus your actual clearance, and then it subtracts it from this recommended clearance, and it gives you this theoretical number. This theoretical number is if you could find a shim that is exactly this size, that's the one that's going to go in your engine. Unfortunately, you probably won't have a shim that's exactly this size, or if you're measuring them all in with a micrometer and it's in thousandths of an inch, you can look over here and see what shim is needed, and then just look at the shims that you have and then put the ones in that place, order the rest of them. Or you can come over here to the side where the closest OEM shim available, this is the Toyota OEM parts, and you look up this 5.50 Toyota shim size. Here's the part number, 13751-46250. I've actually ordered that one, but Toyota 13751-46250. It comes up. Go down here, McGeorge Toyota. This is the cheapest ones that I could find. They're actually $15. So you could take it, add it to cart, and then go back to your spreadsheet and then do the same thing for this one. 13751-46170. Go back here and you can actually type in their website. So type in the part number, there's another one, add it to the cart, and you can keep doing that for all of the shimless buckets until you get all 24 of them. But the problem with this is if you follow that exact same thing that I just said, then there's a little bit of an issue because I don't know what your feeler gauges are like, but if you look at mine, my feeler gauges go from 0.152 to the next one up is 0.178. That means there is a 0.026 difference between these two feeler gauges. That's a little bit of a problem. So that 0.026, if I come over here and I add 0.026 to this 5.34, that's 5.366, or it would really just be 5.36. So what I'm trying to say is this actual clearance here of 0.152 can be anything between 0.152 and this next number up, which is 0.177, the 1,000th of an inch below this feeler gauge. The 178 feeler gauge will not go into it if it's a 177 clearance. So if I look at this actual clearance here and this says 0.152 millimeters, is that really 0.152 millimeters or is it 0.172 millimeters? Because if it's 0.172 millimeters, then that is 0.02 millimeters higher than what I actually think it is when I look at this actual clearance here. That's a problem because if I look at this closest OEM shim that's available, a 5.34 shim or a 5.32 shim, which would be 2/100ths of a millimeter, so it would, 0.020, you just subtract that 0.020 from this 5.34, that's 5.32. If I put a 5.32 shim in here, it should show this same exact measurement. It'll show that same exact clearance. So I'll think all along that my clearance is actually 1.52 when really it could be 1.72. Knowing that that's an issue, what I built into this spreadsheet is the ability for you to override this calculation. Now what this calculation is if I click on it, It's these two, this red and the blue cell added together. So it's your actual shim size that I measured with my dial caliper earlier, mixed with my actual clearance that I measured with the feeler gauge. I can override this, right? Because if my actual clearance can be a little bit taller than this 0.150, which I know this is different, 0.150 and 0.152. I actually have two different sets of feeler gauges. That's why this says 150 and this says 152. My 152 feeler gauge wouldn't fit in, so I dropped down to the 150 and that one did fit in. So I'm accepting that little bit of a, where this actual clearance is 0.02 of an inch tighter than the other ones. It's not that big of a deal. It's only 0.02 of an inch. Anyway, this total height is this red cell plus the blue cell. Once those two things are added together, there's still whatever is between this feeler gauge and this feeler gauge. So it could be anything under 0.177. That's considering this is, I'll just change this to 0.152 just so that it's easier to look at right now and not get confused. But anything above 0.152, say if it's 0.177, then that would make this total height, like the actual total height, would be 5.54 something, close to 5.550. So this total height would be a lot smaller than what it actually is. Because of that, I put in the spreadsheet the ability for you to type over here. If you watch this cell here, whenever I type in 5.540, that number goes up 0.08 of an inch. That's really cool because what that does is that gives me the ability to override the total height that's calculated based off of this and this. Now, why is that useful? Well, let's say you go all the way through and you measure all of your shims and you put those in here, and then you go through and you measure your actual clearance with a feeler gauge on every one of the valves. And now you want to make it a little more precise. What you can do is you can actually copy all of these numbers. So I'm going to copy, and then you can paste special. This is LibreOffice, different from Microsoft Excel. It's an open source software. It's free to use. If you have Excel and you've paid for it, then that's fine. You can use that. But I don't have Excel on this laptop, which is why I'm using LibreOffice. This is an Excel document and it works perfectly fine being opened in LibreOffice. So if you want to download that and install it and run it, you can use this spreadsheet for free without having to pay Microsoft. So that's why this table looks a little bit different than it would in Microsoft Excel. Now, if you're looking at this and you're following along in Microsoft Office Excel, then whenever you click Paste Special, you want to look for the thing that says Values. And then once you click Values, I'm overriding the data in those cells. So now it's going to put just the numbers in here where this was formulas and this is numbers. So this is important because now, once all of these numbers are in these white cells, I can completely change all of this data here and here. And whatever was previously entered here will stay the same. And whatever shim size the spreadsheet was recommending to you is now going off of these white cells. Once you do that, you can go in and say, like, what I did, what I recommend doing is taking the closest shim sizes and swapping them around. Like, say, taking the 47 and the 48, swapping those, and then taking the 35 and the 38, switching those, putting the 42 and the 41, swapping those around. I don't know, you get the idea. You swap these shims around with the closest available sizes. And I say to swap them with the closest sizes because what you don't want to do is put one of the shims in that completely takes away your clearance that you have over here, and then you have the bucket that's pushing on the camshaft. You don't want the bucket pushing on the camshaft. That could actually cause problems. So when you swap them around, just try to stick with close sizes. As long as you have a bucket in that position, and if you don't have any buckets that you could swap around, so like if there's nothing close to a 53, then just leave it there. Swap the 53 with the 48 later after you're done swapping the 48 with the 47, something like that, right? So what this does is this gives me the ability to look down this spreadsheet here and say, like, okay, well, all of these numbers, now that they're moved over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to redo all of this. So let's say now I want to take this what are two that are close in size? I'm gonna come down here to the 37 and the 38. So these. So if you look, like this is the total height, 37 and the 38. So these are the total heights that I have right now. And right now, this total height and this total height, so those are the same. They're going to change. So first, I'm going to put the, let's say I'm going to put the 5.37 here and put the 5.38 here. So now I've just swapped those two shims, put the camshaft back in, torqued everything down. I'm going to come over here, and since that one was a 5.37, but I put a 5.38 in, that means the shim is taller, so my clearance is going to be tighter. So now this would be probably 0.130. I don't know what my feeler gauge is that's below 1.52, just off the top of my head. But say that instead of 1.52, now it's 0.130. And then I'm going to go down here, and now since this one used to be a 38 and now it's a 37, well, now that's a slightly smaller shim, so that means the 0.178 is probably going to be the feeler gauge that goes in. Well, now when I look at this, like, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare these two numbers. So this 5.510, well, it's still shorter, it's still a smaller number than 5.522. So 5.522, I can put this other shim back in the spot because that's likely the closer. Like there's a 0.012 difference between this number and this number. That's a pretty big difference, right? So just with me swapping two of the shims around, I was able to use a slightly different thickness feeler gauge, and that gave me a different total height. So total height, I would say, is the absolute most important measurement on this spreadsheet that you can see and that you can use. If I come down here and I look at the 5.548 versus the 5.532, well, now this 37 shim with this actual clearance, this is closer to the true height between the bottom of that cam lobe and the top of that valve stem. That's all these two measurements say. Your shim size plus your actual clearance, that's the very top of your valve stem to the very bottom of your cam lobe. Unless you're running a shim over bucket that is, say, 2.75 millimeters, then your shim over bucket, then that would be your actual shim as it sits on top of the bucket. So the shim size plus your actual clearance. Back to this though. This total height is the most important measurement that you can have on this spreadsheet, because from that you can determine what your recommended clearance is. So now that I know that this 5.548 is the highest total height that I've measured so far with my shim size plus my new feeler gauge measurement, then I can take this 5.548 and type 5.548 over here, and then I'm going to go up, and every other shim size that I switched around, I'm going to measure those again, and I'm going to get different total heights, and I'm going to take those different total heights, and let's say if I did the same thing up here and it said 5.510, then I would take 5.510 and type it there. And let's say on valve number 4, let's say it said 5.580, so I did 5.580, and I do that. So like everywhere that this number that's in the gray cell is higher than what's in the white cell, then I just type that number over here in the white cell. And again, everything in these white cells overrides whatever was in these gray cells, because this spreadsheet is built to look for the highest value between these two numbers. Whichever one's the highest one, that's what it's going to use. It doesn't matter if this is 0.001 and this is 10 point whatever. It's going to use the highest number that's in whichever one of these two cells. If they're both the same thing, then it's going to use the same measurement. If the one in the white cell is lower than the one that's in the gray cell, it's going to use the one in the gray cell. If the one in the white cell is higher than the one in the gray cell, it's going to use the one in the white cell. I'm going to explain at the very end of this how this whole spreadsheet works if you want to build it or customize it or do something completely different. All that's up to you, but that's going to be at the end of this video. So I hope that makes sense. Again, total height is the absolute most important measurement that you can have, and that is the combination of actual shim size plus actual clearance. So in a shim over bucket setup, your actual shim size would be the shim as it sits on top of the bucket, mixed with your feeler gauge measurement that is between the shim and that cam lobe. So in a shim over bucket setup, this measurement is going to be everything from the bottom of the camshaft to the very top of that empty shim bucket that wouldn't have a shim in it, because the shim would be shim plus feeler gauge. I hope I'm not overcomplicating this. So that's that. Really cool feature. It's one that I especially like. It saves a tremendous amount of time. So you can go through this and you can do that over and over again, and you can keep swapping around your buckets and putting different buckets in different positions until you get the highest possible total height. You could do it 50 million times if you wanted to, as long as you're careful taking the camshaft out every time you take it out and every time you put it back in. The only thing you're looking for is the highest number of these, and eventually you will run through every possible combination of shim sizes plus actual clearance so that you have your actual total height. Because once you have this actual total height, the only thing that you need to do is subtract this 0.152 millimeters from this, but the spreadsheet does it for you. So that's the cool thing. So then you can take this, come over here, and then you can look at your closest OEM shim that you have available, look up these part numbers, Google them as I was showing earlier, add them to your cart, wait on them to come in the mail, put them in your engine, and then after you put them back in the head, you still want to go back and you want to measure with the feeler gauge again, just to verify that the end result is 0.152 thousandths of an inch, if that's what you were aiming for. So that's how you would do it with ordering the Toyota OEM shim. If you wanted to be slightly more precise and do this same way, in my case, some people probably wouldn't agree with this, and I wouldn't blame you for not agreeing with this, but I'm using Junkyard shims, and the next part of the video after I'm explaining this spreadsheet, I'm actually going to show the Junkyard shims that I'm using, and they are in incredible shape. They practically look brand new, because I found some that were from a 40,000 mile Prius that was totaled and in a junkyard, and I have those now, and the majority of those are the ones that are now in my engine. 5.35, 5.47, 5.41. A lot of these odd numbers that are listed here came from that Prius, because off the Toyota assembly line, I talk about this later, but on the Toyota assembly line, you have odd numbers and even numbers that come off that go into the car. That way it's more accurate that way. If you just go online and you buy the parts, you're gonna buy these shimless buckets, they're only going to go up in increments of 0.02 of a millimeter. So 34, 36, 38, and then a 40. They're all going to go up in increments of 0.02 of an inch. I want mine to be a little more precise. So I want to go up in 1/100th of an inch. So I'm putting the 37 or 35. Or if they're an even number that didn't come out of the Prius, then I would order those. I think I only had to order 6 buckets. So yeah, so I ended up lucking out with this because I have a ton of odd buckets that I can use that came out of that Prius engine. So those allow me to dial my engine in a little bit more precise, and I like that. I like that when I look at my actual clearance over here that was measured with a feeler gauge, I feel pretty comfortable in knowing that, like, okay, well, I dialed it in. I have my shims they're pretty accurate. I've swapped them out, and I've got my total height. I've got that dialed in, and I've got that calculated, whatever my total height is for each one of these valves in the engine. And I have my recommended clearance here that it's subtracting from this total height. So that's giving me the ideal shim, not only the Toyota part number that I can go online and I can order, but if I want to pull one from a junkyard, I can use these sizes here. So the 5.35, 37, 37, all these odd numbers I can use in my engine to give me the most accurate valve lash. This is my collection of shimless buckets that I've gotten from the junkyard, or I've gotten on eBay from low mileage vehicles as they've been sold by that seller. And I've gotten them all from a pretty good price. I'm not gonna brag, but I've got them all for a pretty good price. So why would you want to use these shimless buckets from a junkyard? Well, you look like, I like being very precise. And if you look at this one, like this is, if you look at the number on the inside of it, this is a 37, because coming off the Toyota assembly line, off the factory floor, they had odd and even numbers. If you go online right now and you try to find a 37 bucket, you're not going to be able to find it unless you're somebody selling it for, you know, used on eBay or whatever. So these 37 buckets, this is 5.37 millimeters, but these only came off of the Toyota assembly line. All the other ones are going to be like ones like this is an even number one, so this is 5.38. So if you want to be a little more precise, you want your valve lash dialed in a little bit better, you can use these. You have to pull from a lot of different engines in order to get all the sizes that you need, but basically you'll end up with, eventually you will end up with all the sizes that you need. So what engines are these from? So these were actually from a 40,000 mile Prius engine that was just totaled, but it only had 40,000 miles on it. So when you look at the top of it, like, they look practically brand new, right? And I'm going to show how the light scatters in a second, but those are actually in better condition than these, which also look really good. But these were the original ones that came out of my 2JZ head that I'm working on right now. These are from an early 2000s AZ engine. It's a 2AZ, I believe, or 1AZ, one of the two, but it was a RAV4 engine. And these aren't so bad. Even though it looks like there's a little bit of swirling, the light doesn't scatter in a scary way. So there's just, yeah, there's a little bit of wear on these, but it's not too bad. And I think these were ones that were from a different engine, so the wear is a little bit different, but it was a different engine, but it was also another AZ engine. And then these, I'm not using this at all. This is absolutely horrible. This is like horror show. This is just ridiculous. This is from an engine where somebody decided, well, I'm not going to change my oil, right? And they don't change their oil, and this is what happens. Like you get the oil breaks down, and then you have these. You can kind of feel these swirl marks. Like they don't. It's a little bit, but definitely if you're comparing this one to this one and you're running your finger across it, which I'm getting smudges on these, and that's not going to work out very well for my laser pointer. So these were from a sludge engine that they just decided not to change their oil in. And then these on the very, very far right, get this out of the way. This was actually from the same engine. It looked identical to this one. Like they had the same swirl wear marks and just looked really bad. But what I did, just because I was curious what would happen, I actually took 400 grit sandpaper and then 1500 grit sandpaper and then metal polished, and it actually came out to be pretty good. If you look at the reflective surface on it, like, there's still some scratches on it. I probably could have gone up to 2000 grit and then used metal polish a little bit more, but this took just a few minutes to get it to that. And it was doing it by hand. It wasn't doing it by any machine or anything. Like I measured this one, like this one was originally, this was a 42, so it was 5.42 millimeters. And when I measured it again, my dial indicator shows it as a 0.212, which 0.212 is 5.41 millimeters. So this is, I've changed it essentially to a 41 now. So if you wanted to sand the bucket down, you can. The sides of these are a little more worn, right? Because it's been in a sludge engine, and this one actually has some surface rust that's developing on it because I didn't plan on ever using it in an engine. But can you do that? Yeah. Is it a good idea? Maybe. Going through these buckets though, like just starting with the Prius one first, since that one is from the NZ engine, you look how the light is scattering off of it. Looks actually kind of good, right? There's no weird swirls that are coming off. It's reflecting a perfect dot on the white paper. Coming over here, running this across this shim bucket. So this is one that was from the 2JZ engine, one of the original ones that was in the 2JZ engine. So you look how the light's scattering across it. It's kind of making those little swirls, right? Some of that's probably going to be fingerprints because I didn't clean it off well enough, but that's what it's going to do. It did look a little bit better than this before I put fingerprints on it, so my apologies for that. I probably should have cleaned the top a little bit better. This one that's from the AZ engine that also has a little dog hair. I'm not sure if you can pick that up, but my dog hair gets everywhere. So light's not really scattering in a really weird way, right? It's scattering mostly normal. Come over here, this one's a little worse. It's getting a little bit more light scatter, but it's not too bad. And then going over to this one, that is just crazy. So the way the light is scattering on that, it's like it's alive. That just looks bad. I would not ever use this in an engine. unless I'm only planning to run it for 1,000 miles and just destroy my cams, because this is going to wear your cams pretty quickly. And this one is also, it was just like this one, but I ran sandpaper across it. 400 grit, 1500 grit, and then the mother's aluminum polish. And this is not aluminum, I was just using the aluminum polish on it because it's just what I had. So you can use better materials. You can probably use a metal polish along with 2000 grit sandpaper, maybe 2500 grit sandpaper, and then polish this up even nicer. But this only took a couple minutes without even using any fancy machines. So if you want some odd size buckets, go pull them from a junkyard. You can use them to measure and use multiple bucket sizes in your head before you order all of yours online. Or if you're lucky enough, like me, and you find a Prius that has 40,000 miles on it, or any one of these engines that has 40,000 miles on it. Obviously this Prius engine is going to be the newest one that has these types of shimless buckets. So if you could find one of these in a junkyard, save these. These are just in incredible shape, 40,000 miles. So now let's look at all of the really deep details of how this spreadsheet works. If you want to make your own, if you want to, if you're watching this video, I don't know, 20 years from now and my website's not up anymore, so you can't go and you can't go and download the spreadsheet. How does that spreadsheet work? Well, I'm going to walk you through everything that I can think of on this spreadsheet. I'm going to go left to right, top to bottom, and go through every little thing. A lot of this is repeated and it's really the same thing. So each column, like everything that happens in this column is the same. Everything that happens in this column is the same. Everything that happens in this column is the same. As a lot of them are like that. So it's going to be pretty easy. So coming over here to the actual clearance, there's nothing fancy about this. All these gray cells that are over here, these are just basic. All the gray cells that are in this top section, they're just labels. All the gray cells that are over here, those are just labels also. They're just numbers. You can change those till your heart's content, and just whatever, it doesn't matter. All these that are in these white cells, these are just numeric entry. Obviously you can't put letters in there because you can't calculate letters. So put numbers in. So these two, this is just C7 plus E7. So everything that's in this column, this is C8 plus E8, C9 plus E9. Everything that's in this column adds this to this, and it shows up here. That's all that this does. So everything that's in the F column is an addition of what's in the C and the E columns all the way down. Every one of these, they all do the same thing. This column is only a number entry column. That's why it's white, so that you know that you can only enter numbers in there and there's no formulas. This column, however, this one is where it gets a little bit interesting, right? So I can't double click on it to show what it's thinking, but it looks like it's only looking at this F column and comparing it to the D column, but it's not. It's actually looking at the max value between the F column and the G column. As you can see, this says here, max F7 colon G7. So everything from F7 to G7, which is basically these two cells, it takes the maximum value of those two cells, which in this case it's 5.660. It takes that and it subtracts the recommended clearance, because if you look at the formula, it's maximum of F7 and G7 subtracting D7, and then D7 is this. So that's how this number is achieved. So that's pretty easy. This one that is decimal inches is basically, it just points to H7. So this one that's right here, it takes it and it multiplies it by 0.0393700 and then a bunch of other numbers. So I added, I don't know, I think it's like 10 numbers, something like that, to the, whenever I looked up how you convert decimal inches to millimeters, I added a ton of numbers after 0.039 because I wanted it to be as accurate as it can be. So it's not just 0.039 times H7 and whatever's in that H7 cell. It's actually 0.039 ... a bunch of other numbers. So it gives you a pretty accurate number here, and it's all rounded up because you really don't need anything. I mean, I guess you could right click here and then go into the properties and format this to show you 4 decimal places instead of 3, but 3 is more than enough. After that, it just gets excessive. So this max allowable shim clearance, which actually this should probably be minus instead of, it's probably a little error that I had in this, but max allowable shim clearance, which would be 0.152 to 0.252 in this case. All this does is it takes this number here and this theoretical new shim size column, which again, theoretical new shim size is your total height minus your recommended clearance. So this max shim size available, it takes this number, that's this theoretical shim size, and it subtracts 0.1. Now it subtracts 0.1 because this maximum shim size that you need, if you subtract 0.1, then you're adding 0.1 to your recommended clearance. So whatever you subtract from the shims, you add in clearance. That's why I did it this way. So when you subtract 0.1 from that theoretical shim size, then it's the same thing as 0.25 over here. And then the closest OEM shim available, this is where it gets a little more complex and the beauty of Excel just really shines through. This is a lookup table. So a lookup table basically, it tells Excel to look in a certain range of cells for a certain number, or could be text, but in this case it's looking for a number. So in this one, it's looking for anything that's in this H7, with this blue cell, in cells K39 to K90. And there's a $sign there just so that those don't change. $sign kind of locks that value, that thing in place so that it doesn't, that's separate. I don't really care about explaining that. K doesn't really have to, the $sign doesn't really have to do with the calculation. So it looks in this K column here, so this is the K column, everything from cells 39 all the way down here to this 90. So all of them that are here. So the lookup table goes through and it looks for the closest number to whatever it was up here. And let's say if it's looking for 5.500 because that's the one that's still within the window that I'm looking at. So let's say, how does this know, this lookup table, how does it know to find 5.500? Well, what it's going to do is it's going to look, because it's a lookup table, it's looking in H34. That's this one over here that's highlighted in blue. So it's looking for the closest number that is 5.511. So it's going to go here and it's going to say, okay, 5.500, so 5.511. So it's going to keep going down and it's going to look up all the way until it hits the closest number to 5.500 without going over into the next number. Because once it hits the next number, 5.52, it would be building it up. So this column absolutely needs to be ordered from lowest to highest. If they're ordered from highest to lowest, then it won't work. So this other one over here, it's a little bit more complex. So in the L column, so it's also a lookup table, but this one works slightly differently because this one, it looks up what was already found in this K column. So it looks up in the K column and then it looks for that same number down below in the K column. So it would say, okay, 5.440, and then Excel would run down and it would look for 5.440, and then the rest of the formula, it looks for the cell that is adjacent to 5.440. So whatever is in this place, if it's my stuff, that is the thing that's beside this 5.440, then if I go back up here, look at that, my stuff. So 5.440, it pulls back my stuff instead of, yeah, so now just fix that, undid. So that one's pretty easy also. The formulas are a little complex, but yeah, it looks up in K12 and then it looks in K column for that value that's in K12, and then it looks in L column the value that's beside the one that's in the K column. So that's that. This next column here, so what this one does is this one is the part of it where it looks for the actual clearance or whatever your OEM shim that it's recommending you. So this spreadsheet is telling you it's the 5.44 shim is the one that you should put into that slot in the head. So once you put that in, what is your actual clearance going to be? Well, considering you've measured accurately and you have an accurate total height, because that's what it's looking at, it's going to tell you what that shim size is minus what the total height is. So shim size minus total height is going to give you actual clearance. So the more accurate your total height is, the more accurate your clearance is going to be. This is also just another basic lookup table. This lookup table operates exactly like this lookup table. The only way that it's returning these odd numbers instead, like the 5.35, where this column only has even numbers, is if you scroll down, because the lookup table is going in the N column, and it's still looking up stuff that's in the H column, but it's looking for that value in the N column. So if I go down here, this is where it's looking. Where the other one was looking over here, this one looks over here. So yeah. And then everything that's in this column, it actually works exactly like everything that's in this column. There's no difference. It's just, the only difference is it's which cells it's looking at. So it's taking this cell here and it's subtracting it from this value over here that's in these two. So if you have an odd number, so this 5.35, it's subtracting that from these numbers over here. And the total height, whichever one is the highest total height, it subtracts it from that one. These that are these white cells over here, these are just for notes. You can type notes, whatever. It's nothing crazy. So this, I was typing medium, easy, and hard based off of how easy it was to slip my feeler gauge into that spot in the head. So if it was easy, I put easy. If it was hard, that means it's like barely going in, but it finally slipped in. And then medium was, I feel a little resistance, but it goes in, right? These numbers off to the side here, they're nothing. All they are just numbers to help you line up. Like, okay, so this is valve number 2, this is valve number 5, this is valve number 8, because you're typing notes in over here. And that helps out to know if you're typing in note number 8. I wouldn't want to type in something up here and not have these numbers here. Type in something for note number 7, and then when I run the cursor over here, I get confused and I'm looking at number 8. But what I've typed in were the notes for number 7, but I'm looking at number 8. So that's that. Exhaust works completely identical to intake. The only difference is just the numbers that you put in. So here I have recommended clearance, and I just have this higher recommended clearance, and this is the 0.203, where this one is 0.152, which also I skipped over this, but everything that's in these cells here points up to what's in this top cell. So if this said 0.153, then everything that's down here is going to show 0.153. If this says, I don't know, 0.189 or 0.89, then everything's going to be 0.89. And all your calculations are determined based off of that 0.89. That's a huge recommend. That's not a recommending. That's not a clearance. So that's that. And then the very last thing, last little thing, off to the side over here, you have these cells that do the conversion from millimeter to inches. They actually do inches to millimeters, but what it does is, say like this one, it gives you the decimal inch compared to whatever the millimeter is. So this is just a number entry. So you could type in 10.45 and it's going to give you what 10.45 millimeters is in decimal inches. So yeah, that's that. That's the entire spreadsheet and how it works. If you want to expand it out and add to it, the quickest way to expand it out and add to it, if you click on these numbered, the numbered column, the ones that are built into Excel, if you click on these and you highlight the whole row, then you can insert rows. This is, again, this is LibreOffice and not Microsoft Office Excel, but you can insert rows above. Excel works the same way. So you insert and it adds a bunch of blank columns. So what you can do now is you can take all of this. So like 6, let's say I want to make this 7 and then 8 and then 9, because I have I guess a 9-cylinder engine. Sure, I have a 9-cylinder engine. That makes sense. That, and I'm just clicking the merge and center button. It looks a little bit different on Excel. So 11 and 12, I can highlight those two if I want it to continue on and do 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And I just drag down and I have all those numbers. Those were increased. So this, since this is a formula, I'm going to click on this bottom right again, click that and drag that down. That expands the formula out. So if anything that's entered here, it calculates. And then these are all formulas also, so I can highlight all the way across and then click the bottom right and then drag down. And when I do that, it gives me all of these numbers. This says pound n/a because there's nothing there. It's not applicable. So if I put 0.2, that's not a point, 0.14, 0.56, I don't know, I'm just being whatever, 0.34, 0.5. Then 5. So now I have all of these calculations are complete, and I have my 9-cylinder my 9-cylinder engine is set up. Oh, I think, yeah, there is a 9. There's a W18, right? So the W18 has 2 heads. I just have 2 heads or 4 heads. I don't know. However Bugatti made the W18, unless it was a W16. I don't know, but either way, yeah, so this is how you would expand out the spreadsheet. And I guess for the sake of mentioning it, if you have a Ducati and this is valve number 1 and this is shim, so I can have valve 1, 2, 3, and 4, and this can be shim, opening shim, and then the closing shim, opening shim, closing shim. And since it's an O and a C, I can highlight those two and I'll just make those repeat all the way down instead of numbers. That's how you can build one of these spreadsheets. If you want to build one, everything that I just mentioned, if you were to follow it yourself, then you can build it yourself if you wanted to build it yourself, but I don't know why you would do that because I have it up on my website so that you can download it. So that's all for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and God bless you guys.